Thank you, Jake. That's my least favorite part of getting up and speaking is trying to make everyone quiet down. It makes me very uncomfortable. Welcome, everyone, to Bible class. It's our Wednesday nights. We're doing a series of character studies. We're having different men come up and teach different classes. And tonight, we're going to be talking about Hannah, holding fast and letting go. So if you got your Bibles with you, go ahead and open up to the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. Now, if you've got a finger, a pen, a marker, something like that, go ahead and open up your Bibles very quickly to the book of James chapter 5. James chapter 5. I want to start off with the question, why do we do character studies? This is not something that we've really addressed in this class, but at the beginning of this year, in the first quarter, Jake Smith and I had the pleasure of teaching the high school class. And we were told that we could teach whatever we wanted. And we decided we're going to do character studies. And one of the things that we hit really, really hard in like our first couple classes was to point out that there's a reason that we do this. It's very easy for us, I think, to read our Bibles sometimes and to think that the people that we read about are like superheroes. They do things that we can't do and we will never be able to do. And so we read their stories because it's really cool and because it's in the Bible. And so, we don't study these people because the examples that they give us in their lives are unattainable. It's true. We had prophets, they did miracles. There are things that happen to people in the Bible that will never happen to us. But the reason that we do this is because they can teach us how to live better lives and how to live the way that God wants us to live. In the book of James chapter 5, there's just this kind of throwaway line that's thrown in there. Beginning in verse 16, James is writing about the power of prayer. And he says, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. And he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. There at the beginning of verse 17, James saying, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. What that means is that Elijah was a person. He was a person the same way that we are people. God doesn't speak to us. We don't get to perform miracles, but we can have faith the same way that Elijah did. We can believe the same way that Elijah believed. And because of that, we can live by faith the same way that Elijah did. And that's why we do these studies. And that is why we're going to be talking about Hannah tonight. Now, brief little aside. Why Hannah? I've got one opportunity to teach this class. I've got a whole Bible full of people that I could talk about. Why did I choose Hannah? There's a great answer for that, I think. The Bible kind of goes out of its way to tell Hannah's story. Like, really, she shouldn't even really be there. The book of Samuel is, for all intents and purposes, a history book about the kings of Israel, how the whole monarchy started. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel is all about Saul and David and their lives. But the story is told through the eyes of a prophet, Samuel. And so already the book is kind of odd. But the book doesn't begin like other books about prophets. You open up to the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, something like that, and the book's going to begin, and the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah and said, and it's just going to jump right in. But Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel starts by telling a story about his mother, which is just abnormal. The fact that Hannah's story is recorded in the Bible is kind of ridiculous. And as we read her story and we start to get a better feel for why we're doing this, her story is going to remind us of other stories in the Bible. It's going to remind us of other people, other things that have happened. And in every single one of those scenarios, except for maybe one, Hannah comes out on top. Her story is like other people's story in the Bible, but it's better, I promise. So let's jump right in. 1 Samuel chapter 1, we're going to begin reading verses 1 through 8. So there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from the city to worship to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And the rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. And so it went on year by year. As they went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? And so, setting the stage, Hannah has it pretty rough. Just setting the scenario, who Hannah is, what her scenario is like, kind of got a bad hand, right? Doesn't look so good. What are we seeing in the story that's kind of making us feel bad for Hannah? Well, her husband is no help at all, right? I love this because it is one of the few and maybe one of the only examples in the Bible where someone just says the stupidest possible thing and just puts his foot straight in his mouth. Yes, her husband is no help at all. What else?
She's barren, which was really something that women were ashamed of in those times. And so she feels horrible about it. That's that super understanding husband on top of that.
Absolutely. To make it worse, she's one of two wives. Anytime in the Bible when you see a man had two wives, immediately a light bulb should just go off and say, okay, conflict and drama is going to happen in the story and it's going to revolve around this. She's one of two wives, and to make it worse, one has children and she does not. Simple as that. There's already this comparison, and it just gets made worse by the fact that she has no children. Anything else? Okay, go ahead.
I think she would obviously feel second fiddle to the other wife, because when you think about Hagar and Sarah, when Hagar could bear children, she told Sarah, I'm the true wife. So she probably feels like she's not even a true wife. She probably doesn't even feel like she has that status.
Absolutely. Another thing that happens in this story is that when they go up and they go to sacrifice, her husband gives her a double portion. She's kind of given like special treatment, which in some ways makes her feel good. It's like, oh, I love you, but in the same way, it's like, you don't have everything else, so I'm gonna give you this. And it's kind of like a consolation prize. It doesn't feel great. Let's see. Her rival makes fun of her, gives her a hard time. Her husband's kind of an idiot, doesn't make things any better for her. This is where we find Hannah. Really a rough spot. So I talked about seeing other stories in the story of Hannah. You already brought up a great one with Hagar and Sarah and Abraham. Does anything else come to mind? Anything else? Any other stories you guys can think of? Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. You got them both. Excellent. So this is where we find Hannah. Now the story really begins. Can I get someone to go ahead and read verses 9 through 18 of 1 Samuel chapter 1?
Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat, was sitting on the seat by the doorpost in the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. You want me to go through 19, you say?
For 18, please.
Then Eli said to her, How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, No, my lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and may the Lord of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. She said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad.
Thank you. Good news, that's the longest reading at any given time we're going to have tonight. We've already got it knocked out, which is a good place to start. So we find that Hannah is a person with a lot of problems. She's in a lot of distress. And so what does she do? She holds fast to her faith. That's going to be the whole theme of this class is going to be about holding on to one thing and letting go of something else. Hannah holds on to her faith. She brings her troubles before the Lord. It's about as simple as that, right? We see this all over the place in the Bible. She comes and she prays. And she prays real hard. That's what I love about this story is this prayer that Hannah prays is very unique. We see a lot of different types of prayers in the Bible. We have people like Nehemiah who say those little quick ones as he's going in places and having interactions with different people. We have Jesus in the garden. We have Daniel praying on his knees with his windows open toward Jerusalem. We see all kinds of stuff. But Hannah's stands out. There's something about it that just almost moves you as you read it. We see a lot of really great descriptive language in this, where she says that she is deeply distressed, weeping bitterly, she prays, pouring out her soul, praying out of like great anxiety and vexation. And that says something about Hannah, that she chose to, with all of these problems, take it to the Lord. Her faith clearly came first in all of her troubles and the problems that she was having. I think we can see that. She shows like a great intimacy with the Lord, how she just bears it all. She comes in there an absolute mess, was not embarrassed to be seen that way. Eli, we're not going to make this class about Eli, but he gives her a hard time. He's clearly misreading the situation. Kind of makes a fool out of himself, not for the first or last time in this book. But Hannah does the right thing. She holds fast to her faith and takes her problems before the Lord. Do we have any comments about the prayer? Because as much as this seems like the best part of the story, it's not.
I think it's interesting that she's not vague in her prayer, she's very specific. And I think we are, sometimes we shy away from that. She doesn't say, please just give me a child. She says, please, Lord, give me a male child. And then she makes a promise to the Lord if he answers her prayer. So they're both very interesting.
It's definitely interesting. Ryan talked a little bit on Sunday night on Sunday, about how our faith is not transactional. I have a hard time dealing with that part of the story. We'll get to it. But yeah, she makes this vow to the Lord. She prays this very specific, very deep, heartfelt prayer. And that's the first thing that came to her mind. And I think that's a great thing.
Kind of reminds me of David. When you read through the Psalms, you read David's prayers, and it's just like, I wouldn't say that, man. Maybe we calm down a little bit, or we gather ourselves, but like the Lord is pleased, and the Lord loves David's heart, and his heart is pouring itself out to the Lord. And so it's the same thing in this situation where it's like, well, I wouldn't make very specific things that I want from the Lord, and it's like that's exactly what he wants, is whatever you've got to give him in your prayer. And so it's just cuts me a little bit.
Absolutely. The specificity of the prayer and the willingness to be completely vulnerable with the prayer. And like out in the open, this wasn't something she did at home. Like she was in front of people, a mess, and pouring herself out before the Lord. Absolutely. Jenny.
I was thinking that her offering of giving him to God is really special too, because God has said so many times in the beginning about your firstborn is who is owed to me, of the children and of animals, and she is not asking for more than one child at this point, but she's already, I don't know if that's what her mindset is, but I was thinking that's a really huge gift that she, like, I feel like God was, her heart is trying to
Yeah.
give what she can give the most special things.
Absolutely. There's definitely a certain part of that that's in the story. I want to move on because this next point might take a little bit, and it is the point. Like this whole section here is why I wanted to teach the class on Hannah. We're calling this letting go of our troubles. We're not actually going to read another section of the story. This happens here in the part that we've already read. It's certainly easy for us to pray when things are hard. We read this story and we read about this prayer that Hannah prayed, and we're like, that is some prayer. There's a lot that we can learn from it. But the act of doing it, I don't think is like a real revelation to any of us. Like, oh, you're stressed, you're having a hard time, there's things you're concerned about, you pray about it. Yeah, I think all of us feel pretty comfortable with that. But the thing that Hannah does very well is that she leaves her troubles at the Lord's throne. And it's really subtle. It's maybe not that subtle, but it is subtle. It's not something that's just like, hey, look at this. But there in verse 18, at the very end of this section we read, and the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. That whole section we talked about earlier with her husband putting his foot in his mouth, saying something really stupid, that happens before they ever go to Shiloh. She is distressed and bothered by this constantly for a long time. And she finally makes it to Shiloh where they're worshiping, and she has this great prayer. And finally, after praying and pouring herself out before the Lord, all of a sudden her face is no longer sad. That is something else. I think that is what makes Hannah so special to this. I can think of like two good examples to really paint this picture. Imagine that your car's not working. Imagine like your cooling fan doesn't work. Feels like 120 degrees outside, and your AC doesn't run. Your car's overheating. It's miserable. You take it to a mechanic, and you're like, hey, I'm having this problem, and I think you can fix it. The mechanic says, yes, I can definitely fix your problem. You say, great, and you get in your car and you drive home. And it's like, you took the problems with you, man. Like, you missed the point. That's what we're talking about, is here's my problems, I'm going to leave them here, and I'm going to walk away. I think about what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, where he says, come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. All this, something we've all heard before. Imagine coming to Jesus and you've got this big giant weight, this backpack, this big heavy thing. And Jesus says, drop it off. Take my yoke upon you. It'll be great. And you're like, no, thank you. I want you to know that I have this problem, and I'm going to take care of it. I think very often in our lives, we want to hold on to things with two hands. We want to tell God about it. We want to have these prayers like Hannah prayed, and we want to vent and say, this is what's bothering me. You just want to say it. So you pray it to God. But then at the same time, you want to take a hold of it with your other hand and say, but I'm going to try to fix it. And that's not what we're asked to do. Having faith in the Lord in this scenario, and in every scenario, is about holding fast to our faith in God and letting go of everything else. So, her face was no longer sad. For Hannah, here's the real thing. For Hannah, praying to the Lord and setting it at his throne was the solution to her problem. It wasn't part of it. It wasn't the first step. It wasn't just putting words to it. It was the solution, saying, God, this is what I've got. This is what's bothering me. Here it is. And then she left it there, and in faith, trusted that God would hear her prayer and take care of it. Now, we talked about biblical parallels. We talked about Sarah and Hagar and Leah and Rachel. Let's talk about that for a second. How does this story compare to those?
Sarah couldn't just let God. She had to try to figure out the solution for God.
Absolutely. She said, this isn't working, so with my other hand, let me take care of the problem. What else? Leah and Rachel did the same thing, right? They had problems, Rachel says, I can't have kids, and my sister sure has a whole mess of them, so let me take this into my own hands. Let me solve the problem for myself. Here's my servant. They manipulated each other. They worked around each other to try to solve a problem that they couldn't solve. In fact, you could argue they made things worse for themselves by taking it into their own hands. This is not something that Hannah does. She doesn't come up with some harebrained plan to have a child, to make her husband love her more, which she didn't need anyways. She leaves her faith in God, and for her, that's the solution. I think it's more than I can put words to. That's why it's everything. So, holding fast to your commitment. We talked about holding fast to our faith, letting go of our troubles. Hannah's going to hold on again to something else. Picking up on our story, 1 Samuel chapter 1, beginning in verse 19. And they rose early in the morning, that is Elkanah, his family, Hannah, all of them. And they rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord, and they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. For she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. Two things I want to note about this section of the story. We've already found, she prayed, her face was no longer sad. That's already the best part of the story. But her face is no longer sad, and the first thing they did, they got up early and they worshiped. It's the first thing that she did. I think that's a great example for us. When we have problems, have our faith in the Lord. Worship him, trust him. That is important. Another thing is that I like the way that the passage says it. In due time, she conceived and bore a son. I don't know how long in due time is. Doesn't tell us. Doesn't matter. Because the point is she didn't get immediate results. She still had to go home, and things were still the same. For a while, for some indeterminate amount of time, until eventually her prayer was answered. And that's just to start. I think that's incredible. But all of a sudden, she now has a son, which is great. This is the thing she prayed for. But now, the vow that she made to the Lord comes into effect, comes into question. It becomes like a factor. Going back to verse 11, just to refresh our memories about how this is all working out. And Hannah, she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. This is not a small promise. This is a very, very big promise. And now, all of a sudden, she's got to hold up her end of the bargain. This is just the scenario she finds herself in. She is someone who cannot have a child, is very heartbroken about it, prays with everything she has that she can have one, and now she has to give him up. She's left with a choice, ultimately, but this is where she's at. So let's continue with the story. Just read a little bit further on. Can I get someone to read verses 21 to 28, just there through the end of the chapter?
The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her along with a three-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And we worship the Lord there.
Thank you very much. So, what does Hannah do? We found the scenario she's in. She's got a promise she's got to keep. And, well, biblical parallels. Oops, jumped a little too far ahead in our reading. But what does this remind us of? Is there anything that we can think of that maybe sounds similar to the scenario that we're reading here? Abraham and Isaac? Yes, definitely. There's another one I'm thinking of. I hate it when other teachers do this, when they ask an open-ended question with one specific answer in mind, but here I am, like, we are the things that we hate to become. I think of Jephthah and his rash vow, because it almost looks like that on its face, right? We talked about this. Hannah, someone who was heartbroken, who wanted one thing in the world more than anything, and she makes a promise saying, if I get it, I'll give it right back. And all of a sudden, it's time to make good on that promise. And you're almost like, that sounds like a really stupid thing to do. You know, like, it just feels like it doesn't make any sense. The more I think about it, the less it makes sense, and I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry. But this is what it reminds me of. It reminds me of Jephthah. Does anyone want to give us a brief rundown of Jephthah? What his whole deal was?
Jephthah went to battle, and he told God if he won the battle, that whatever came out of his house to greet him, the first thing he saw would be he would sacrifice to God.
And it turned out to be his daughter.
His own.
I don't know what he was expecting, man. Like, what do you expect? Like, a good dog to come out and meet him or something? Like, it just seems like a silly thing to do. Again, it just seems like this doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, why would you say something like that? And that's kind of where Hannah's at, and that's kind of what it looks like. But, again, imagine we had this conversation about 3 minutes ago before reading the passage. Hannah shows no sign whatsoever of backing out of this deal, which is very impressive, because we try to back out of things a lot smaller than this. I like it very much, the way that she says it. She says that, let's see, I should have wrote it down. Verse 22, I will bring him so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. She's committed to this vow. She says, this is the promise I've made, and I'm going to keep it, which is, again, incredible. That he may dwell there forever. See, there it is. And when the time comes, she follows through. So the time of the year comes up, they're going to go to Shiloh, and she says, I can't take him yet. He still needs his mother. Like, I'll wait till he's weaned, which already is another decision that, again, is showing like full commitment to this. She's not just saying, I'll keep my promise eventually. She commits like, as soon as I can possibly do this, I will. Jay, do you have something?
Well, I have a question of something if you had looked at, and it's probably just contrasting with what
Sure.
you're saying. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. That's all he had to say about it? I mean, the husband had nothing. It was all turned over to her. I mean, well, she was the one who's making all the great plans.
Yeah, she was making all the promises.
So I guess ultimately that's good that he steps aside, but I don't know if you had any.
You know, I hadn't actually thought about that. You know, there's not a lot of great things to say about Elkanah, right? I mean, he does keep his vows, and he does go up yearly, and he does all the right things, but it seems like he's a little hands-off at times.
Oh, to me, it's like the opposite of Job's wife when he's going through that terrible time and she's like, curse God and die. Here's an example of someone who's made a commitment to God and it's the right thing to do, and he encourages her to keep the vow she made.
That's a really good point. Absolutely, is that he doesn't say, hey, why are you doing this? Like, he doesn't try to stop her. He doesn't pull the Job's wife thing and say, hey, you don't have to keep doing this. Like, this is the promise you've made, and this is what seems right to you. Do it. Like, at the same time, this was also his son. It wasn't like this was nothing to him.
But you're giving him to God. Like, I mean, I always think about this verse a lot. Like, that's my role as a mother for all my children. They're just lent to me. I'm supposed to give them back. And this is a very real picture of someone doing that.
It's a very literal picture of someone doing that. It's unbelievable. So one of the things I thought about was, you know, she says that she will do this after the child is weaned, and I thought, like, how old is that? What does that look like? I didn't look it up. I did not really care to look it up. I don't think it really matters for the sake of the story. Like, if it's not recorded in the Bible, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but for the sake of the story, it doesn't. Because what Hannah is committing to do is saying, as soon as he doesn't physically need me, I'm going to keep my promise. And it doesn't matter if he was whatever age. The point is, she kept her promise and she did not try to stall. I think that's really incredible. Like, I don't have kids. I don't think, I have no idea when that's going to happen for my family. It doesn't matter. But like, this is unbelievable to just say, here's this thing I want and I'll give it right back and I'm not going to stall. Like, I can't even wrap my head around it. I've planned for this. I knew I was going to talk about this, and I still just don't have the words for it. It's really something else. So what do you think Hannah could have done instead? I mean, she did the right thing. I think we've all kind of like established that, and even if we don't necessarily think we could do it, I think we're all on the same page. Like, Hannah does the right thing. But she doesn't try to bargain with God on this. She doesn't try to hey, I will keep this promise, but let me wait till he's 18. Let me wait till he's so old. Or, I said that in a really emotional time, and I didn't really mean it. I didn't really know what I was committing to. She doesn't back out. And another thing that I think is interesting, we're talking, we kind of compared this to Jephthah and the vow that he made that was all across the board called a stupid decision, a rash vow, something just dumb thing to say. Hannah is not talked about that way. The text does not say, and she made this rash vow to the Lord. No one says this to her. Her husband doesn't even say, what are you doing? He says, this is the promise you made. Do what seems best to you. Hannah doesn't seem to waver on this decision. No one paints Hannah in this negative light in the story, which immediately contrasts her to Jephthah. She makes this promise, and she's committed to it. And it might seem rash, but it's not.
And if you just drop down just a few verses in chapter 2, you know why. It's not just like this, I wonder how she had this follow through. I wonder how she had this trust. Well, it's just keep reading. And she says, there's no rock like my word. She makes it very clear that she doesn't hold on to comfort and trust in her own, in her own ways, in her husband, in her situation. That's how she got through, and that's how all of us, bad days aren't so bad when we know the anchor that holds us. She knew.
Yeah. I wish we had the time. I'm not going to make the time to read the prayer because there's still more stuff we want to talk about, more things to say. But go ahead.
No, I'm just observing. I'd always pictured her giving her son in the temple as a really sad scene, and I'm sure that she felt sorrow over that and walking your little boy away at such a young, tender age. But what she says is very positive. She says she finds Eli. She said, "Remember that crazy-looking lady who was here? That was me, and this baby is here." And the Lord granted me my petition. She seems to be saying, if I'm reading it right, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Here he is, and here you go, and he belongs to the Lord. She seems to be very just appreciative of all that God has done and not wistful for what it's going to look like for her.
Absolutely. And she pulls out all the stops too. She doesn't just say oh, here's a promise I made. Here's my son, just like I promised. They bring the 3-year-old bull and the grain offering. And they go all out and say here we are. We're here to worship. And here's this other thing. Here's this miracle that God gave me. And I'm going to keep good on my promise. Jenny.
Just making me compare with Jesus, and what they both went through had to be so hard, but it does seem like their husbands have a certain kind of, I was viewing it as a respect for them. And so, it's interesting to hear everybody's thoughts on it, but I was thinking he didn't need to say anymore, he trusted her. But just the sacrifice that they made, that ultimately, everything we have goes back to the Lord. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I would take a different view based on Numbers 30 when it talks about the vow that a husband or a wife takes,
Mhm.
and if the husband agrees or not. If the husband was to cancel the vow that the wife takes, he's responsible for the outcome. So he would be responsible for the birth of another child.
Yeah.
So I think Elkanah is utility.
Yeah, he's definitely, that in mind definitely seems like he's doing the right thing. Again, he's like, hey, we got our child. I'm not going to put myself on the hook for another one. And that's the thing. I don't want to spend the time talking about Eli or Elkanah or any of the other stories because Hannah's like, she's the star of this story. Like, really, she steals the show. She's incredible. I hope that this theme I'm trying to bring out is making sense about holding fast and letting go, about saying I'm going to hold on to my faith and my commitment to serving the Lord, and I'm going to let go of everything else, even if it doesn't make any sense. My children, my troubles, the things that I think I can control, she lets go of them. And we're going to see that one last time in Hannah's story, letting go of our control. Like I said, we're not going to have the time to go through and read the prayer that Hannah prays, but please do. If you've got like the ESV Bible app, it'll read it to you. You can just play it in the car on your way home. Like, it's great. Definitely read it. But if we jump down narratively through the story, beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 2 in verse 11, we're going to get through the last part of Hannah's story. Beginning in verse 11, and then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. So they have left. Samuel is now left with Eli. He's not going home with his parents anymore. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. The custom of the priests with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servants would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle, cauldron or pot, and the fork, and all that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. And this is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give meat to the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." And if the man was to say to him, "Let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish," he would say, "No, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Now Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed in a linen ephod. Samuel kind of bookends that section, and it's like, hey, I thought we were talking about Hannah. She's not in that part of the story, in case you didn't notice. But we got to remember what Hannah has done here. Hannah has promised to the Lord, if you give me this thing that I very badly want, I will give it right back, which is incredible. She promises it before ever receiving it. In essence, sacrificing her son to the Lord. Someone earlier had said it reminds them of Abraham and Isaac. That's what she does, like in a very literal sense. Here is my son, I'm going to give him to the Lord. It's just like that. And this is the one I said where I was like, maybe I'm not going to like try to argue with Abraham sacrificing his son to Isaac, because that is another phenomenal story. But this is kind of a similar scenario that we're seeing in Hannah. What Hannah does here, if we remember this, she's giving up her ability and her right to raise her own son. Think about it. She goes back home after dropping Samuel off and giving the sacrifice and praying this great prayer. They leave. And what's changed for Hannah in her daily life? She goes home. She has no children. The other wife still does, and probably still gives her a hard time. Is like, hey, you just had a son. Where is he? Why'd you leave him home? What are you doing? Like, you're still all alone. Things haven't really changed for her on a daily basis. Her life is still very much the same. But part of that is that she gives up her ability to raise her son, and she leaves her son with Eli. And I think it's neat that it tells this part of the story immediately after Samuel's left there. It's like, hey, and Eli is not known for being a great father. I don't want to make this about Eli, because it's not what we're here to talk about. But he doesn't seem to do a lot of things right. His sons have no respect for the Lord, for the work that they do. Like, Eli is a priest, and he's raising his sons to be priests, and they do not care. They have no respect at all for what they do. Later on in the story, Eli rebukes his sons, and they do not listen to him. So Eli does not have the respect of his sons, and his sons do not respect the Lord either. They just worthless men, just like the Bible says. And that is the man that Hannah leaves her only son with, giving up complete control over what his life is going to be. She says, I've made this promise, and I'm going to commit to it, and if this is the guy in charge, okay, that's fine. She gives up complete control of the greatest blessing she'd ever received, and left it with someone who, by all visual accounts, probably couldn't be trusted. It's not a great look. But Hannah shows her faith by doing so. Here's the thing, she does it anyways, and comparing this to Abraham's story, she volunteers the test that God puts before Abraham. God said, if you really love me, sacrifice your son, who he already had. Like, he already had the son. Hannah says, I don't have a son, but if you give me one, I'll give him right back. And Abraham, in that story in Genesis 22, says that he believed that even if he had to kill his son, that God could raise him from the dead. Hannah says, I'll give him to you with no hope of getting him back. She just completely gives him away. And so maybe that's why I'll give her the edge over Abraham in that story. Just because, like, I will give him to you sight unseen with no hope of getting him back. That's not what's important to me. It's incredible. I don't have the words for it. And I don't want to rush through that point, but I've only got 3 minutes left, and the applications are too important to me. And I think they should be too important to you guys, so I don't think we're going to argue too much. So we talked about the big theme with this story is holding fast and letting go. Talking about walking by faith. This is something that Hannah does extremely well, and I think it's visualized very, very well in her story. She holds fast to the faith that she has in God. First off, she's got all these problems, she's got this trouble, and first thing she does is she takes it to the Lord. She takes it to the Lord, and that's like the first step is just having that trust in the first place. But then she also holds fast the commitment she made to serve God, even when it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. She wasn't trying to hold on with God in one hand and her in the other trying to control the situation. She takes her hands completely off of it, which I think is incredible. But walking by faith, to hold fast to God, to our faith in him, and to our commitment to serving him, will require us to let go of everything else. Everything else. Whether that's our control or our troubles, whatever it is, we have to let go of everything to let God take that control from us. That's what faith is all about. And that's...
It says the Lord clothes your womb. He's in control of the beginning, and by acknowledging it, it's kind of the beginning of the faith part.
Yeah.
Read her prayer. Then chapter 2 is just teeming with that. But she has the perspective, this trial is set before me for whatever reason God's chosen.
And she holds fast to the faith no matter what.
Yeah, and it just kind of, when you read the prayer, it's applied to her perspective to everything else in life.
It's wonderful. Again, read the prayer. Read the prayer. But I want to close with the last section we have about Hannah. Because there's a part of the story. She holds fast her faith. She lets go of everything else. It's perfect. The perfect demonstration of walking by faith. And there's like a little bookend to Hannah's story. If we read verses 18 to 21, this is what it reads. And Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed in a linen ephod. And his mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband and to offer the yearly sacrifice. And then Eli would bless Elkanah, his wife, and say, May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition that she asked of the Lord. And they would return to their home. And indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. Hannah's faithfulness to God is rewarded in this story. Like, she does everything right. She lives her life the right way, and she's rewarded for it after the fact. That's the important thing to remember. We can read the end of the story and think, see, it all worked out. Like, God rewards her for this. She did all of this not knowing or expecting that it would happen. If Samuel was her only son, she would not have changed it. She did everything the way that she did, not knowing or expecting an additional reward from God. And that is everything. Bell's rung. Kids aren't here yet. You guys can have the last comment. All right, thank you guys. Oh, Lisa, you got it.
You know, I never thought about, when she was pouring out her heart and soul, to think that someone significant, like a priest sitting in front of you, is like, what have you been drinking? That right there on a dime could turn a person if they were at any moment of weakness, and it would have ruined everything, and that right there is incredible in and of itself.
Absolutely. I'd be too embarrassed to be like, you're right, I'm sorry. Just like whatever it takes to get you off my back. Leave me alone, you weirdo. Yeah. Hannah is great. Be Hannah. Thank you guys.